Welcome, everybody. I'm Martin Bell, and I'm talking from a corner of my living room in NW11. Is that a dagger that you see behind me? Yes, it is. It's ornate Yemeni dagger given me by the health minister of the Yemen when I made a tour for UNICEF. I'm going to talk about my life a little bit and what may be appropriate now. I've been a war reporter for 18 wars, and I did 4 years in the House of Commons, and I have been for the last 19 years an ambassador for UNICEF. So it's been quite varied, and I dare say quite eventful too. But like all of us, I've never lived through anything like this. It's turned all our lives upside down. I think it's important at a time like this to exercise the mind as well as the body. I'll talk about routines a bit later on, but keep the mind active. I wrote a little a book of light verse about 8 years ago, and I set myself a test to see if the brain cells were still in gear, that I would write a coronavirus poem, an acrostic coronavirus poem, which means to say that the first letter in each line must spell out the word coronavirus, which means it have to be 11 lines. It goes like this. Could anyone have prophesied or warned against this scourge? Right from the start, our hopes subside, our virus cases rise and surge. Now is the time for fear and panic on board our very own Titanic. Vaccines, alas, do not exist. Infections flourish nationwide. Rare is the cheerful optimist. Unloved, alone, and in distress, save us, the NHS. I'm sure you can do better than that. It's not going to be. It's not exactly an immortal ode, but it keeps the mind going. And I'm sure you're in touch with your kids, with the students. I'm sure that they are very interested now in plagues. Sometimes the young people ask me what's the most important subject they should study. I say there are a dozen countries in the world, from Laos to Nicaragua, from El Salvador to Croatia, where the most important subject for the young to study is landmines recognition. For the rest of us, it's history, and still more history. I don't think we can know too much about the histories of previous plagues, starting maybe in about 430 BC in Athens, when the chief Athenian was Pericles. Go on a little over a millennium, the plague that afflicted Constantinople and marked the beginning of the end of the Byzantine Empire, the Black Death, of course, and the Great Plague in London in 1665. Fortunately, you can get that immortal text by Daniel Defoe free to air on the internet. It's called The Journal of the Plague Year. And it is a marvelous book, quite short, I'd say about 30,000 words. So I hit upon the idea to keep my brain in order that I am writing a modern version of the Journal of the Plague Year. As of now, I'm about 30,000 words into it, and more crazy things keep happening every day, and I've got a publisher interested. In fact, I'm in a curious position of probably having two books coming out in the autumn competing with each other, but everybody's lives are affected. I think you're in the most stressful profession, actually, potentially, because you want your kids to learn. They need you. And I'm not sure what the answer is about opening schools, because I'm not a professional, but I do know that our kids are missing out on a lot of stuff. I'm not writing it entirely in the style of Daniel Defoe, because he had long serpentine sentences and he scattered commas about like confetti. But the continuities between then and now are quite extraordinary. Again, it was an unseen plague. It came originally, we think, from China. Plagues were carried by sea in those days on ships with infected creatures in them. Sometimes there were rats on grain ships. A whole fleet arrived in Palermo of 12 ships from Turkey, and the sailors were found to be visited by the plague. It's a phrase that he uses a lot. Daniel Defoe is visited. Now, I think we have a lot to learn there. There were a lot of quack remedies back then, and what he calls mountebanks and people peddling false cures. We have a monarch who stood her ground and is now in isolation in Windsor Castle. Charles II, he only recently restored to the throne. He fled with his court west to safer places. And Defoe blames the court and what he calls it the distemper of the times. He blames it as God's punishment for what the courtiers had been doing, having too much fun, apparently. It is, as I say, a marvelous text, and I've learned a lot from it. I keep going back to it, and he was, the old thing was, he wasn't really a witness of the Great Plague of 1665. He was 5 years old at the time, but he wrote it in 1722 on the basis of the diaries that had been written by his uncle Henry Foe, and it's a much better read than Samuel Pepys, who was a contemporary of the plague, but seemed to have regarded it mostly as an annoyance of interrupting his well-connected social life. Defoe tells his story with great compassion, and I think that I think your kids would get a lot out of it. It's highly up to date. I'm going to talk a little bit about routines now. I think surviving this kind of plague is. He takes routines. You'll notice that for all of us, one day is very much like every other day. So I get up at the same time, I have breakfast with lots of coffee, and I start writing my Daniel Defoe update. Then I go walk about in the garden. I can do about, I've got it's not a huge garden, but I go up and down the back lawn 30 times, and I sit in the sun and I wonder what I'm going to write next. Then I go indoors and I'll write for another two hours on what I see on the internet, what's happening. The bit I added yesterday, the first election in the history of democracy in which the turnout was 0%, happened on the 10th of May. It was the Polish presidential election. It was too late to halt it, so all they did was they just closed the polling station so nobody could vote, and they've rescheduled it because the president's term of office runs out on the 6th of August. So there are little things like that. I've written quite a lot about Brazil because it's dreadful what's happening in Brazil, and of course I've written a lot about the United States and about 2 Trump chapters, because I was, no reason you should know this, but I was the John Sopel of my time. About 3 iterations ago, I was the BBC's Washington correspondent at the time that Ronald Reagan was there. I wouldn't like to do it now because poor John Sopel, he's unable to leave Washington. I traveled all over the country, but the madness that erupts from the White House briefings is really quite extraordinary. Then I have my little nap, and then I get up and I write some more, and I'll take a little bit more exercise. And at 6 o'clock, I actually watch at least the first part of the BBC News. But here's something I think is really important for all our mental health. Don't waste a lot of time. Indeed, don't waste any time on the rolling news channels. It can become completely obsessive. Some of the wars I've been in alongside British soldiers, I've talked to families. I lectured the 1st Battalion of the Cheshire Regiment before they came out to Bosnia, because I've been in Bosnia since the war began. And I said to the families, don't watch the rolling news channels. You're just going to worry yourselves almost to death, or just limit yourselves. So I watch that at 6:30. And then I'll have a glass of something stronger than orange juice. And my lovely partner cooks for me, and it's really quite early to bed and more of the same, but always being alert for some new oddity that may be happening in these extraordinary times. You see, Justice Defoe thought this was an affliction visited on the people as a punishment. There was a much more religious time than it is now, as a punishment. So it may be now. I'm writing the closing chapter, which is kind of a prose poem, really. And I'm reflecting that we have inflicted, the human race, we are the most destructive creature on Earth, the most destructive in the planet. We raid it for our own luxury and comfort. We overheat it until the polar ice caps are melting. And this is nature getting back at us. I wish we knew more about it, but I think that one of the effects may well be to make us more humble, and that would be, and I think that would be a good thing, and to draw us together. I mean, I've been ambushed from Nigeria to Bosnia to Knutsford Heath, and the scariest thing that ever happened to me was being ambushed by Neil and Christine on Knutsford Heath in 1997. I just wasn't ready for it. So open yourselves to influences. I think that's the way to do it. I've got a few questions here have been sent in. Claire Rennie, Christ the King College. Do you have a daily or weekly routine that helps in times like this? No, actually, I do, and I've set it out, and it doesn't change very much. But what surprises me, I don't know if you feel the same, that when I thought the time would drag, that a week would feel like a month. In fact, it's passing incredibly quickly. I'm now in my 8th week of lockdown. I stay in my house, I stay in my garden, but I think it's very important to keep in touch with friends and family, and I'll come to that. Jackie Carver of Woodside, what have I missed most about being in isolation? I think the same as all of you. It's the cheerful company of friends and family. Of course, we can do a lot by video link and so on, which was not available to Defoe in his day when there were watchmen keeping you in your house. I mean, the self-isolation isn't new. It's been going with every plague. I have 2 daughters whom I haven't seen for about 12 weeks. One is in the administration of the University of Exeter. She lives in Exmouth. The other, my elder daughter, Melissa, is the CNN correspondent in Paris. I told her to stay out of television news, whatever she did, so she ignored me, and she's doing brilliantly. So I'm very well clued up about the French response to this emergency, which I may say has been rather faster than the British, but I'm definitely not getting into politics. It's up to you whether you want to keep the company of the minister. Comes up at 5 every evening to tell us what's happening. I started adding that to my daily routine, but it reminded me too much of the House of Commons, so I don't do that. I don't do that anymore. Thomas White of Parkside. You've met many people in times of crisis. How do they manage their fears? I think the point I would make here, and this is from personal experience, that fear is not, courage is not feeling no fear. Courage is dealing with the fear that you feel. Don't be afraid of fear. It helps to keep you alive. I was once driving across the airport runway in Sarajevo, no planes flying. The only way in past the siege was to drive across the runway where you're open. And of course, there are Serbs at either end of the runway and armed Muslims either side. I nearly made it. I was driving a battered old BBC Vauxhall Carlton. Just at the end, I heard something like a plop of raindrops against the driver's door that I was driving. And I realized we were under fire. But it was, the bullets must have been at the end of their trajectory. So, and they didn't penetrate. So we made it through. And I actually didn't have any armored vehicles in those days. They came later. I actually wrote to Vauxhall and thanked them for making a tank without knowing it. But fear, of course, you feel fear. But you also learn what not to take for granted. I think you live in an extra dimension. Just as you can dread things more, you can appreciate things more. You learn what not to take for granted. Now, Rebecca Jones, Forest Fields Primary School. How do you filter out the real news from the false? Now, that's a tough one. I think more than ever, don't believe everything you read. It happens that the pandemic of COVID-19 has coincided with the pandemic of falsehood, spread almost invariably by the internet and conspiracy theories, which are an offense to the truth, but and also an offense to democracy. I like to read a range of papers. I'll probably look online at the Guardian on one side and maybe the Daily Mail on the other. But as this is an international pandemic. That's the definition of it. I also go abroad. Well, obviously, because my daughter's broadcasting on CNN, I'm up to date with what she's broadcasting. But I've taken out subscriptions to, well, in my experience, were two of the best newspapers in my 12 years in Washington, D.C., the Washington Post and the New York Times. And they're both reliable and steady. They remain reasonably calm amid the amazing goings-on in the White House. I just reflected. I told you I was there working out of Reagan's White House, the 1980s. It was the heyday of that extraordinary political romance between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Once a year, at least once a year for 8 years, she'd be received with full honors on the South Lawn at the White House, with ceremonial and so on. Then they'd go to the Oval Office, and it was famously said at the time that first of all, she told Ronald Reagan what she thought, and then she told him what he thought. It was an interesting time to be a White House correspondent. And these, I think that these two papers especially, they have some excellent columnists who get behind the day-to-day nonsense of the briefings. Because the other thing is we can't be too well informed. I mean, you as teachers, sooner or later you're going to be back in the front line. Some of you are already dealing with a few children still at school. I think they've all had to become semi-experts on infections. I was reading today about the health minister of Kerala, which is a huge state in southern India, who has had a brilliant war, so to speak. She saw it coming, and she intercepted the first visitors to the state coming out of Wuhan. And this is a state with 35 million inhabitants. It's had only 4 deaths, which is quite extraordinary. And you look around the world, and the countries most afflicted, most visited, Defoe would have said, are the ones with the highest levels of air traffic. US, UK, the big capitals of Europe, not spread by rats and grain chips anymore. It's spread by people flying, and it's going to change everything. And part of what I'm writing about is looking ahead to what's going to change. Our way of dealing with each other has to change. Our politics has to change. Our respect for the natural world has to change. I'm not buying into these theories of the virus escaping from a laboratory in Wuhan. I think I've always tended to the foul up theory rather than the conspiracy theory. But I'm thinking quite a lot about it, and I am filtering out the fake news. I mean, the real news is quite scary enough without listening to the conspiracy theorists. And I hope I'm going on the verge of the political here. I hope our politics is going to change, become more consensual. See, my position in the House of Commons, I was there from 1997 to 2001. And there's no crossbench. There's a tiny little seat facing the speaker. So I used to park myself there. But it's technically, you're not allowed to contribute to a debate from there because he's just behind a line painted on the carpet. It's called the bar of the House. And one day an MP from Canterbury, I think, was saying to see the honourable member for Tatton in the House. And he was interrupted by the Deputy Speaker, who said, on point of order, the honourable member for Tatton is not in the House, and you may not refer to it. Because they could see me. I wasn't in a position from which I could intervene. So I would hope that we'll get out of this a more consensual politics, and one in which I have a feeling, and I had it when I was in the House. I think politics is too important to be left to the politicians. Something like that. I tended to hang out with the awkward squad, people like Dennis Skinner and Tam Deal and Gwyneth Dunwoody, but it's all a long time ago now. But it has informed really the rest of my life. Now, Eleanor Baker of Colleton Primary School, what spiritual practice do you employ at a time like this? This is a difficult one. I think these are easier times for people with a strong religious faith. Mine happens to have been eroded over the years because I've been in conflicts where religion actually played a part other than comforting and consoling. The Bosnian War, there were essentially a three-sided war, because there was a side war between the Muslims and the Croats, of course, being Roman Catholic. And it was like I felt that these things were being used as sort of badges of identity, faiths. And then I lost what remained of my faith completely. One Christmas carol service, I was reading a lesson in St. Paul's Cathedral, and they didn't allow me to read it in the authorized version, and it just didn't feel the same. But I will admit to one thing, that I'm deeply superstitious. I think a lot of people in dangerous situations are. For instance, I hear that I read that the bomber crews in the Second World War were they used to go through rituals, like doing the business on the wheel just before you got on the up into the aircraft. Whatever you think will keep you alive. And I've been really lucky because I've been in all these wars, as I said, but I've only been wounded once. And as in the present emergency, it taught me what not to take for granted. And every day like that has been like the first day of the rest of my life. I'd call it the uses of adversity. I know you've heard from Terry Waite. He's an old mate of mine. I'm very fond of Terry. He has the advantage of being about a year younger than I am, actually. But we had a curious. I mean, I come from Suffolk, and I'm one of the last surviving members of the Suffolk Regiment. He's now living in Suffolk, but he came from Tatton, just outside Manchester, the Tatton constituency, which I represented in Parliament. And he was originally approached to be the independent candidate. And he turned it down. He told me this. because he said already done one 4-year term as a hostage, and he didn't want to do another. So they came to me, and I did it. But he, in his book Solitude, which I'm sure he spoke about, he draws the distinction between solitude and loneliness. I mean, there's nothing wrong with keeping your own company when you have to. But when and if ever this affliction is over, then we can all get out in the real world, I think, and savor it more. And I don't think it is going to be the same again. I'm just hoping that my Daniel Defoe book gets published. As I said, they've got it. I can't promote a book that's only half written, but I'm trying to draw things together. There's a chapter. The main ending chapter is called Lessons Learned. You know, we have to learn lessons from this, because I'm sure we are bound to repeat it. I mean, no one seems to have seen it coming except Bill Gates, the wizard of the internet, and the health minister of Kerala in southern India. We didn't. I can't blame our politicians for not seeing it coming, because they didn't. I didn't see it coming either. But here we are in the midst of it. I think you're going to find that when those kids get back to school, they're going to be eager to learn. Obviously, they're missing their mates. I think it's a very difficult time. I think teachers, I would say, are second only to NHS workers. And goodness, do we appreciate the NHS now? I think we've been trimming it around at the edges for too long. I had a bad fall at Embankment Station about 3 years ago. And I waited, because I was the front night library, to hang out for old war reporters. It's just next to St Mary's Hospital. So I went to the A&E in St Mary's Hospital, and 4 hours later I got attended to, which I'm not complaining about. But there was no nurse. It was just a doctor, and it was contracted out to a private company. So that taught me that the NHS was already fraying around the edges. So we learn what matters and what doesn't. We learn, and I'm putting this towards the end of my book. You know, the people who are famous for being famous, you know, the television hosts and even the footballers. So what do they really contribute? I'll tell you who contributes. You contribute. You, the speaker, the teachers, the carers, the binmen, the doctors, the nurses. They are of a different order of worth to us all. And I'm sure you miss your children, and I'm sure they miss you. But I'm pretty sure that one of the questions sent to me was about when should schools reopen. I think it's entirely up to you. You're on the front line. I'm a bystander. Obviously, the sooner the better, as far as the kids are concerned. But what a catastrophe if we get a second spike in the cases. So I'm not but I do believe there's going to be a severe knock-on effect if children are deprived of an important part of their education. You can't cram your way back into that. So I think this is probably going to go on a while longer. What I do think it's a good idea that we can connect through this marvelous technology. What did Defoe have? There weren't even any newspapers in 1665. There were pamphlets and sermons. And religion, as I said, played a much more important part in their lives than it does in ours. But I do believe that those of faith are very fortunate. I do actually, at the end of the day, I sometimes deliver to myself a sort of secular prayer towards whatever omnipotent force might be out there. And I do think this may be a sort of a punishment, and may we be saner and wiser as a result of it. it's hard to. I'm really. I think I've got a couple of minutes. I just want to tell you how much I value the work that you do and will do. I'm not sure if journalists should be classed as essential workers, but I think the ones who are bringing you the news of the outbreak probably are. And something that's really interested me as this has developed. The BBC, the main news programs have doubled their audience back to where we were. There's no reason you should know this. You know the biggest audience the BBC News ever had? It was the day that Lord Mountbatten was killed on a lake in County Sligo. ITN had a strike, ill-timed strike. So the BBC main news, run by a general reporter like me, read by a general reporter guy called Chris Morrissey, had 27 million. Well, we're not up to 27 million yet, but people are taking the news more seriously, and I hope one effect is going to save the BBC. I'm nearly out of time. I want to thank you for attending. I hope you felt it been worthwhile. I'm just going to now go out and do my morning exercise and write my morning words. Have you noticed, I talked earlier about the passage of time. I'm going to close with one of my little poems. Have you noticed that the older you get, the years don't just succeed each other, the time accelerates. So I wrote this. What's now a slog was once a caper. The less we have, the more we spend. Life's like a roll of toilet paper. It unwinds faster at the end. Thank you for your attention.